I still remember the rumble of the tow trucks and the shocked faces of my neighbors, as if it happened yesterday. Believe me, the day I finally towed half the neighborhood's cars out of my warehouse was one I never expected, but it was absolutely necessary. If you want to find out how a simple piece of private property can tear apart a suburban community, keep reading. This story might just change the way you see HOAs forever. I moved into my suburban neighborhood 20 years ago, right at the edge where new developments meet old farmland. Back then, the biggest attraction here was an abandoned apple orchard. Over time, though, the area ballooned into a fully developed neighborhood, complete with neat sidewalks, manicured lawns, and a homeowners association that had a say in everything from the color of your fence to the size of your mailbox. My property was a holdover from simpler times. It came with a large, unassuming warehouse that once stored farm equipment. I'd used it for my small-scale woodworking business, turning reclaimed barn lumber into custom furniture. As far as I was concerned, that warehouse was my castle. But the first sign of trouble arrived at a monthly HOA meeting in early spring. I rarely attended those gatherings. Most times, folks just argued about whose barking dog was loudest or which neighbor had a yard that offended the rigid aesthetic standards of the community. But that night, my phone rang just as I was settling in for an evening of finishing a cherry wood dining table. It was Audrey, the newly elected HOA president. In her efficient, slightly clipped tone, she insisted I come down to the community center because an important topic regarding your property is on the agenda. It sounded ominous, but I went. The meeting hall was crowded and lively, filled with the usual cast of characters, neighbors I knew by face more than by name. Audrey stood at the front, her chest puffed out with an authority that came from wearing a silver name tag that read, HOA President. I'd barely taken my seat when she started her announcement. This year, we anticipate an increase in community events, yard sales, holiday gatherings, and a series of town halls, she said, glancing at a thick sheaf of papers in front of her. We face a parking shortage. So, after careful consideration, the board has decided that the warehouse property owned by, she squinted slightly, as though searching for my name, Mr. William Bill Parker can be used as an overflow lot for the community. I felt my jaw tighten. The statement landed like a thunderbolt in the quiet hall. My warehouse, now an overflow lot? And apparently, no one thought it necessary to consult me first. I raised my hand, my heart pounding a little. Excuse me, that's my private property. I haven't agreed to anything. Audrey smiled a politician smile, tight-lipped and unyielding. Well, Bill, she said, we're under the assumption that since you don't actively use the large open space behind your warehouse, it could be lent for community use on high-traffic days. Think of it as being neighborly. I protested, but a wave of murmurs swept the room. A few neighbors nodded in approval, while some shrugged as if to say, why not? We need the extra parking. By the end of the discussion, the board had effectively railroaded me into letting them temporarily use the land behind my warehouse. They offered no formal agreement, just a vague promise to respect boundaries and make sure everyone is safe. I left the meeting that night with a bitter taste in my mouth, suspecting that I'd just been blindsided. Weeks passed, and for a while, it seemed nothing much changed. The usual older couples wandered around, walking their dogs. Kids played on the sidewalk. The local teenagers raced their bikes down the street. Except now, I noticed a few random cars occasionally pulled in behind my warehouse. Strange vehicles, the kind I'd never seen in the neighborhood, took up space next to my wood storage area. When I asked around, I got cryptic answers like, oh, the HOA said it's okay, or Audrey told us you were fine with it. At first, I tried to be neighborly. If people parked on the gravel behind my warehouse, just once in a while, maybe I could let it slide. I figured, pick your battles, right? But the trickle of vehicles soon turned into a flood. By late summer, nearly a dozen cars would be parked around my property on any given weekend. They left behind trash, tore up the grass, and sometimes blocked access to my loading dock, preventing me from hauling in new lumber for the tables I built. One day, I returned from an afternoon supply run to discover that someone had scraped the side of my delivery van, a wide, ugly scratch that looked suspiciously like it came from a carelessly opened car door. Whoever did it had vanished without a note of apology. Furious, I went back to Audrey, politely insisting the HOA issue a reminder that the warehouse was still private property. She offered me the same politician smile and said, "We're not responsible for individual driver behavior, Bill, but I'll make an announcement at the next meeting." That was my first inkling that the board had no intention of lifting a finger on my behalf. It was up to me to do something. My father used to say, "If you let people walk all over you, don't be surprised when you end up in the dirt." I was about to learn that standing up for myself wasn't going to be easy, but it was crucial. I mulled over my options and tried to be reasonable. I decided to install a simple chain across the warehouse entrance, with a sign that read, "Private property, no public parking." The sign was yellow and black, glaring enough to catch anyone's attention. I even added reflective tape, so there'd be no excuse about visibility. If the HOA wasn't going to back me up, I'd defend my space in my own quiet way. It worked for about a week. Then, one Saturday morning, I ventured out to do my usual check around the property before starting on a new batch of chairs. To my shock, the chain was lying in the dirt, its hooks broken in half. The no public parking sign was tossed aside like yesterday's junk mail. Lined up behind my warehouse were 3 SUVs, a compact sedan, and a pickup truck with a large Community Sports League decal on the back window. None of them belonged to me or any neighbor I recognized. I knocked on the warehouse door, hoping to see if someone was inside rummaging through my tools or supplies. Thankfully, the door was locked, but the sense of violation hit me like a gut punch. Breaking my chain and throwing aside my sign wasn't just ignoring my property rights. It was an overt show of disrespect. My vision blurred with anger. Who gave these people the right? I marched straight to Audrey's house. She lived in a modern, tan brick unit at the far end of the subdivision, a place with immaculate flower beds and a fence that I swear was always exactly the HOA-approved color. She answered the door in yoga pants and a sweatshirt that read, "Stay calm and organize." Without any pleasantries, I explained what had just happened, even showed her photos of the broken chain. Her response was maddeningly composed. "Well, Bill, I'm sure the chain must have accidentally been broken while someone was maneuvering their car. We can't control every accident." I nearly bit through my tongue. This wasn't an accident. My sign was ripped off, and the chain wasn't just undone, it was busted. Someone clearly used tools or enough brute force to break it. "Don't tell me it's an accident." She shrugged, arms folded across her chest. "I'll have the board send out an email reminding folks to be mindful. But again, we're not legally responsible." It was like talking to a brick wall. The audacity made me wonder if they'd treat me differently if I looked like someone with more clout. Maybe if I wore a suit and tie instead of my usual flannel shirt. I left her doorstep with my blood simmering, resolved to find a solution that didn't rely on the HOA's non-existent goodwill. The next day, I made a visit to my old friend, Sam, who worked for a local towing company. We'd known each other since high school, back when the biggest drama in our lives was who got the prime parking spot at the local burger joint. Sam greeted me with a hearty handshake and asked if I could talk about some big woodworking project for him. Instead, I laid out my predicament: the warehouse, the unauthorized parking, the disintegrating chain. He chewed on his bottom lip while listening. "Yeah, Bill, I've seen this plenty of times. People think because it's near a neighborhood, they can do whatever they want. But private property is private property. If they park there without permission, you have the right to tow them, even if the HOA says otherwise." I asked, half hopeful, half nervous. He nodded. "HOA rules can't override your individual property rights, especially if it's separate from the main residential lots. You've got the deed, right?" I assured him I did. It was an inherited property from my late uncle, and I had the legal papers to prove it, which the HOA had apparently chosen to ignore. Sam offered to help me to set up a towing arrangement. He said if I posted clear signs stating that unauthorized vehicles would be towed at the owner's expense, we could enforce it. Part of me hesitated. Towing neighbors' cars felt extreme. I lived here 2 decades and was on friendly terms with at least some of these folks. A few were in my Sunday fishing club. A couple had bought my handmade furniture. But the bigger part of me felt cornered. If the HOA insisted on continuing to use my space without permission, and if they wouldn't help with the damage, I had little choice. That week, I installed brand new, even sturdier, private property, violators will be towed signs. I placed them at every possible entrance, including the side gate that led through a line of bushes. I even wrote an open letter to the community, making extra copies and leaving them in every mailbox. It was concise and polite. I explained that due to repeated property damage, I could no longer allow any vehicles without prior permission. Next, I dropped by Audrey's house again and handed her a copy of the letter, explaining, "I want you to know it's not personal, but I have to protect my property." She eyed me like I was a misbehaving child. "Do what you must," she said flatly, shutting the door before I could say anything else. Sure enough, a few days passed, and people seemed to respect my warnings. For the first time in months, I could walk around my warehouse without tripping over random cars. A sense of relief washed over me. Maybe the worst was behind me, and the neighbors had gotten the message. But that feeling didn't last. 2 weeks later, on an early Sunday morning when I was scheduled to deliver furniture to a craft fair, I found my loading area completely blocked by a minivan. The driver was nowhere in sight. I glanced around, hoping to see someone searching for their keys or rummaging for a baby stroller. Nothing. It was like the minivan had dropped out of the sky, left there to mock my new rules. And sure enough, my tow-away signs were still clearly visible right in front of it. That was the final straw. I called Sam on the spot. "I'm invoking the towing arrangement," I said, snapping photos of the minivan's plates for documentation. "I want this car gone." Sam's wrecker arrived within 20 minutes, the bright red truck turning heads as it rattled down our quiet street. When he hooked up the minivan and started hauling it away, I half expected the owner to come sprinting from the bushes. But nobody appeared, and by the time the minivan was towed off, I felt a curious mixture of triumph and dread. I knew there'd be fallout. The question was, how bad would it get? The aftermath came faster and fiercer than I imagined. By Monday afternoon, I was bombarded with phone calls, text messages, and emails from furious neighbors. The minivan apparently belonged to Bethany, a young mother from 3 streets over. She'd been at a Sunday brunch hosted by a friend who lived around the corner from my warehouse. The friend allegedly told Bethany it was fine to park there. My response, so it was said, was overkill. But the flurry of messages had a different tone when it came to the official notice I received from the HOA. They accused me of harassment and unsanctioned towing. Audrey, in her letter, threatened to fine me for creating a hostile environment. I read it twice to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. How could I be fined for towing trespassers on my own property? Did the HOA's board actually think they held that much power? I didn't bother calling Audrey. Instead, I went straight to a property lawyer recommended by Sam. The lawyer's name was Linda Morris, a sharp, no-nonsense professional who specialized in disputes with HOAs. The waiting area of her office was bright and modern, contrasting with my anxious mood. Once inside her office, I explained everything in detail, from the initial meeting where Audrey sprang the overflow lot plan on me to the chain being broken and, finally, the towing incident. Linda tapped her pen on the desk, her expression serious. "You're within your rights to tow unauthorized vehicles, provided you have proper signage and the property is indeed privately owned. The HOA has no authority to force you to allow parking there, especially if you have separate deeds. However, it sounds like they've decided to push back. You should be ready." The notion that the HOA might escalate this fight beyond reason made my stomach churn. But Linda laid out a straightforward strategy. Document everything. Send a cease and desist letter to the HOA. Prepare for the possibility that they'd levy baseless fines or drag me into a hearing. If that happens, Linda said, we can counter with legal action. Trust me, I've seen associations fold as soon as a lawsuit looms. Armed with that knowledge, I left her office feeling empowered, yet still braced for battle. Over the next few days, I gathered every piece of documentation. Photos, time-stamped footage from a small security camera I'd installed on the warehouse corner, copies of my deed, and all correspondence with the HOA. I scanned them into a digital folder, labeling everything carefully. It felt like preparing for a war, piling up evidence, anticipating each move from the opposition. And then came the second wave of trespassing. It It was as if, once Bethany's van got towed, other neighbors decided to test my resolve. Suddenly, on a warm Tuesday afternoon, I found two cars parked so close to my warehouse's side door that I couldn't access my own workshop. One was a shiny black sedan, the other an old station wagon. I recognized neither. Enraged, I once again called Sam. For the second time in a week, a wrecker came and hauled off the vehicles, leaving me to wonder if the HOA was actively encouraging people to flout my rules just to provoke me. That evening, there was a note taped to my front door. The handwriting was large and thick, more like scrawl than a letter. It read, "You're messing with the wrong community, Bill. Better watch out." No signature, no return address, just a cowardly threat. I locked up my house tight and sat on my living room couch in the dark for a long time, staring at that note. Fear prickled the back of my neck, not because I thought some neighbor would actually do me physical harm, but because it was unnerving to realize how easily a group could turn on someone. I'd known these people for years, yet here I was, feeling like a pariah on my own land. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a text from Audrey. HOA hearing scheduled for Friday regarding your violation of community harmony. Attendance mandatory. Fines may apply. I almost laughed. The phrase violation of community harmony seemed so ironically bureaucratic, an official label slapped onto the simple act of defending my property from people who felt entitled to use it. The tension rose another notch. Come Friday, I walked into the community center prepared with Linda's advice. The meeting wasn't just a typical monthly gathering. It was a specially called hearing, complete with a panel of 3 stern-faced HOA board members. Audrey perched at the center of the table like a self-appointed judge. About a dozen neighbors sat in folding chairs behind me, arms crossed or murmuring among themselves. One by one, they outlined their complaints, culminating in Bethany's tearful testimony about being embarrassed when her minivan was towed. She said it hurt her family financially because the towing fees were expensive. She wiped at her eyes, describing how she thought I was a nice man, only to discover I was vindictive for towing her car without warning. As if the big red signs all around my warehouse and the letter I dropped in her mailbox weren't enough notice. When it came my turn to speak, I kept my voice level, though my heart pounded. I explained the property's history, how it wasn't part of the HOA's common areas, how I'd endured damage and disrespect despite polite warnings. I refrained from calling out their hypocrisy or telling them how many times I cleaned up their trash. Instead, I stuck to the facts and told them about the threat note I'd received. Murmurs filled the room. A couple of neighbors cast uneasy glances at each other. But Audrey was unmoved. She hammered her gavel with unnecessary force. We, the board, find that Mr. Parker's actions undermine the community's trust. We will be issuing a $500 fine for each towed vehicle. Total $1,500. I stared at her in disbelief. You can't do that. My lawyer says you have no authority over property that isn't governed by the HOA's bylaws. Her nostrils flared. The board decision is final. You have 30 days to pay. If not, further action will be taken. My knuckles whitened as I gripped my chair. I realized any further conversation was pointless. These people weren't operating on logic. They were enforcing their own sense of entitlement, believing they could bully me into submission. They forgot one crucial piece of the puzzle. My warehouse might not be in the best shape, but I had the means and the will to fight back. 2 days after the sham hearing, I mailed the HOA a formal letter from Linda demanding they cease and desist any attempts to impose fines on property outside their jurisdiction. I made sure to CC the entire board, plus the county clerk, just for good measure. Linda also prepared a lawsuit draft, ready to file if the board continued their nonsense. But as fate would have it, the HOA decided to double down before I could even see if they'd comply. On a sunny afternoon, I discovered something that set the final showdown in motion. A large, professionally printed banner strung across the front gate of my warehouse property. It read, "Overflow Community Parking, HOA approved." Beneath it were a half-dozen vehicles angled every which way, some even creeping into the flower beds by my workshop. It was as if the entire board decided to mock me, practically daring me to do something about it. I quietly took photos of the banner and each license plate. Then I marched back to my house, my heart hammering in my ears. Enough was enough. I called Sam again. "You ready to move some cars, buddy?" He gave a low whistle. "Sounds like it's about to get serious." I told him to bring every truck he had, and if necessary, call in backup from other local towing outfits. "I need them gone, every single one of them," I said, my voice steady as stone. Sam didn't argue. We set a time for that evening, after most folks would be home, so they could witness the consequences of their actions in real time. That evening, the tow trucks arrived in a convoy, 2 bright red rigs from Sam's company, plus a couple of contract trucks with different logos. Neighbors came out of their houses like spectators at a fireworks show, pointing and whispering among themselves. The drivers hopped out, checked my signage and documents, then got to work hooking up vehicles. One by one, each car was hoisted off the ground, headlights bobbing as if in protest. I stood at the entrance, arms folded, waiting for someone to claim their car before it disappeared. A few folks ran out shouting, "Hey, that's my car," or "Put that down." But when Sam's guys calmly informed them that this was private property and the owner had ordered the tow, they mostly just sputtered. Some tried to call Audrey. Others threatened me with everything from lawsuits to "you'll regret this." But each threat bounced off me like a dull ping. I tried to be nice, tried to be understanding, and they took advantage. Now, they had to deal with the real-world results. An hour later, the last vehicle was towed away. All that remained on my property were dirty tire tracks and the battered signpost where someone had hammered in that HOA-approved banner. I pulled it down myself, ripping it free from its metal clips. The silent stares of my neighbors trailed after me as I walked back inside. A mixture of triumph, fear, and exhaustion weighed on my shoulders. I knew there'd be more to come, but at least for one evening, my warehouse was finally mine again. As expected, the next morning brought a storm of outrage. Voicemails filled my inbox, some from neighbors cursing me out, others practically begging me to rescind the towing charges. Audrey left an especially scathing message, warning me of drastic legal consequences for defying the HOA's authority. I forwarded each one to Linda, who told me to hold tight and let the legal process play out. A few days later, a letter appeared in my mailbox. The HOA was dropping the fines. Linda's cease and desist letter must have rattled them more than Audrey let on. Instead, they proposed a negotiation meeting to be held at the local courthouse's mediation room. Clearly, they wanted to avoid a lawsuit. Linda arranged for us both to attend. She insisted we wear professional attire to emphasize we meant business. On the day of mediation, I sat across from Audrey and 2 other board members I recognized. A neutral mediator, assigned by the courthouse, guided the discussion. The board tried to argue that they had a right to promote community interests, but Linda swiftly cut them off. She recited chapter and verse from state property laws, highlighting how HOAs cannot claim land that isn't part of their recorded boundaries. Audrey tried a last-minute guilt trip. "You don't understand, Bill. People are upset. They see a big warehouse and empty gravel lot, and they don't see why it should be off-limits. It's not their property," Linda said coolly, tapping the table. "They have no right to be there without Mr. Parker's permission. He has repeatedly posted signs. The board overstepped by encouraging residents to park there. Now, you want him to just understand?" A flush crept up Audrey's neck. The other board members looked away, perhaps finally realizing they'd lost the upper hand. In the end, we drafted an agreement stating the HOA acknowledged the warehouse property was outside their jurisdiction. The HOA would refrain from distributing any materials or signage suggesting otherwise. Any HOA member found parking on my property without permission would be solely responsible for towing fees. The board would reimburse me for the chain and sign damage from earlier in the year. With each concession, Audrey's lips thinned further, but she signed. The mediator notarized everything on the spot, turning a fiasco into a legally binding resolution. For the first time in a long while, I felt the tension in my chest begin to ease. We left the mediation room without handshakes, only terse nods. In the weeks that followed, I kept my new signage up, cameras rolling, and a direct line to Sam. True to the agreement, the unauthorized parking dropped to 0. A few neighbors still eyed me warily, but some came by with apologies, ones who'd realized the HOA had stepped way out of line. Bethany stopped by too, looking embarrassed. She admitted that she'd been misled, thinking my warehouse was part of the common area. We shook hands, and she said she'd pay me back in installments for the towing fees. It's never fun to make enemies in your own neighborhood, especially in a place where folks know your name and your habits. But sometimes you have to stand your ground, even if it means towing cars and ruffling feathers. My father's words echo in my mind. If you let people walk all over you, don't be surprised when you end up in the dirt. I refuse to end up in the dirt. Today, my warehouse stands intact and respected. The HOA knows better than to test me again. In the end, I didn't set out to be the neighborhood villain, but I wasn't about to be their doormat either. That's how I towed an entire neighborhood from my private property, and, in doing so, reclaimed what was mine all along. Thank you for reading. If you found this story valuable, feel free to share it with someone who needs a reminder that sometimes standing up for yourself is the only way to keep the peace.